My name's Chris Hoving, as Kevin said, and I work for the Wildlife Division. I'm actually in the same section as Ryan Wheeler. We work in the Planning and Adaptation section of the DNR's Wildlife Division. So he works mostly on invasive species stuff. I work mostly on adaptation, and most of the adaptation work is in the context of climate change, but it's not exclusively climate change. I'm also looking at how systems change, how resilience is created within social ecological systems. So it's a little broader than just climate. So I want to, before I really get started, I want to do a shout out to Phyllis. I got to rework my slides today because Phyllis so kindly covered like my first like 4 or 5 slides. You know, her talk was excellent. So, you know, if you missed her talk, you know, in a sentence or two, Michigan is really blessed with a wide range of ecological communities. They're very valuable. They have a lot of feedback and diversity within the system that is threatened by invasive species. And we definitely need to be wise in how we address invasive species, especially when we get past the part of the curve where we're talking about prevention or early detection, and we're starting to talk about species that are established on the landscape. So that's sort of my jumping off point, and I get to skip a whole bunch of slides because she had a great talk this morning. If you missed it, I highly recommend going back and looking at it in the recording. So with that, I want to jump into sort of going back, thinking back to when I first started with the Michigan DNR. I was a field biologist working on private lands, and I was doing work very similar to what SISMA coordinators do. I was working with private landowners to control invasive species with the goal of creating habitat for threatened and endangered species on private lands. And so a lot of the work that I was doing was reintroducing fire, using herbicides to control species, doing some prairie plantings, that sort of work. So a lot of this, you know, through the talks earlier today, felt very, very familiar. I was definitely in this field. And I remember when I first started with the DNR, I had this idea that, you know, when I drove down the highway, for example, you know, you'd see all these shrubs and greenery and nature, and it seemed great. And then I spent some time with the Michigan Natural Features Inventory folks like Phyllis and some of the botanists and ecologists, and I learned what autumn olive looks like. And suddenly driving down the highway was a completely different experience. It was like, oh my gosh, there are invasives everywhere. And then as I learned about spotted knapweed and, you know, some of the invasive grasses and so on, suddenly you're just seeing them everywhere. And it changed my perspective. And it really sort of brought home this a quote from Aldo Leopold. Maybe you've seen it before, maybe you haven't, but it's an excellent one, and I'll read through it here. But Aldo Leopold said, one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Much of the damage inflicted on the land is quite invisible to laymen. An ecologist must either harden his shell and make believe that the consequences of science are none of his business, or he must be the doctor who sees the marks of death in a community that believes itself well and does not want to be told otherwise. And that really rang true for me because, you know, suddenly my job was going to people and telling them, these are, you know, the problems that I'm seeing on your landscape. You've got Japanese knotweed over here, or you got, you know, this other species over here. And, you know, sometimes people wanted to hear it, sometimes they didn't, but it was a big part of sort of my growth as an ecologist. The other part of it was learning to see these high quality ecological communities and walking into areas where the ecological processes are tightly interwoven and they don't leave many niches, many gaps for invasive species to invade. When the species do invade, they can be problematic, but there were these areas that really seem to have a lot more resilience, and that was also a lesson to me. I hadn't been able to see that before I started working in this field. So I did that for about 5 years, and then I went on to become worked as the statewide endangered species coordinator. Did that for 3 years, and then I started my current job as the adaptation coordinator. Now, that gave me a sort of some new perspectives from a climate change perspective, and I want to start sort of with the punchline. For those who have seen some of my talks before, I do tend to go all over the place, and people are often wondering as I'm talking, you know, where is he going to land this plane? How is he going to land it? So I want to give the punchlines right up front so that nobody's wondering like where we're going. and then I'll repeat these at the end, and hopefully they'll make a little more sense. First one I pulled straight from one of Phyllis's slides. Pick winnable battles. So when you're working on invasive species, you want to, especially when you're working with species that are established in the landscape, you want to pick those spots where you can have a win, where the work that you're going to be doing is going to be able to be sustained, where the ecosystem, you can expect that it's going to start healing and start sort of closing some of those feedback loops more tightly to keep invasives out in the future. So one, you want to do those, and those are sort of in the resist adapt framework, resist adapt direct framework. Those would be your resist things. But you also want to be explicit where invasion cannot be stopped, or where you're choosing not to stop an invasion. We can't do everything everywhere, and so we need to be explicit about accepting, at least for a certain time in a certain place, that we're not going to be doing work there. And that can be very freeing. I found it very freeing from my perspective. Instead of seeing it as places where I'm doing work and places where I'm failing because there's no work being done, it really becomes an idea of where I'm saying yes to some places and not yet or no to other places. But those no's are so I can say yes to other places. And sort of the new idea or newer idea is to pick places where transformation and novel communities are the new goal. And this is directing transformation. And I'll get a little more into sort of what that means or what that looks like a little later in the talk. I want to get back to this idea of invasive species everywhere. And one of the examples of this was really brought home to me when I was working on my PhD dissertation recently. And one of the graphs that I pulled together for that dissertation was looking at what are the most common species in the understory across all of the state lands in southern Michigan. So mostly state game areas, but also state parks. And we have done inventory on all of these understories and sort of gotten a rough idea of how many acres we have of each of these species. And so not surprisingly, we have mostly red maple and black cherry in our understories. It's a fire suppressed system, so you expect that. But the third species floored me, and I had to double check my math many times to confirm this, but autumn olive covered more of the area than white oak or black oak. And those white oak and black oak are the predominant species in the overstory. See, I knew there was a lot of autumn olive out there. I had walked around, but I hadn't realized that it was the third most common species. I mean, if you look at it in area, 10,000 hectares, that would be about 22,000 acres of autumn olive. And if you look further down on the list, multiflora rose is number 9 on this list. So we have, on our state lands, we have a lot of invasive species within the understory. And that starts to get to this question, well, what do we do about that? We can't afford to treat all of that amount of acres. So what do we do from there, especially in the context of a changing climate? And when I talk about changing climate, it's not just, I mean, the next speaker is going to give hopefully a good summary of climate change and climate resilience and its effects on the work that we do around invasives. But I want to expand it a little bit to talk about not just climate, but other system drivers. So the temperature regime is changing. How cold the minimum temperature gets during the wintertime affects which species, can invade or which species can exist in a given place. One that's often underappreciated is how much the snow regime in an area affects which species can grow there. A lot of species will only germinate under snow, or a lot of species like, say, sugar maple really rely on that pulse of snowmelt in the spring. And if we lose snow, and that's going to be one of the biggest changes we expect to see with climate change, we will expect to see changes in our ecosystem because of that driver. The drought regime is expected to change. We'll probably get a lot more short growing season droughts into the future. But we also have these other things that are not climate drivers, but are also driving change within the ecosystem. One is that we have a depauperate large mammal community within Michigan. We don't have, say, bison or some of the other large species, a lot of the predator species that we had in the past. So we have, deer do a lot of structuring the system. That's probably going to change here as chronic wasting disease becomes more common. So we've got system changes that are happening in one direction and maybe happening in another direction. The fire regime is very different. If we look at, the circa 1800 maps, a lot of the ecosystems there were fire-dependent systems, and the area was actively managed by people for the last 10,000 years. We manage it very differently with fire suppression now rather than using fire widely. And then the last one that I want to mention, because it's another one that we don't think about, is carbon dioxide concentration. So carbon dioxide, the concentration in the atmosphere, is changing the temperature regime, the snow regime, and the drought regime, but it's also a nutrient for plants. Carbon dioxide is one of the limiting nutrients, and so putting more carbon dioxide into the air is in some ways like spreading nitrogen all over the landscape. It's a nutrient that is changing how these plants compete. And each plant species is going to react a little bit differently. We know in general, vines seem to put on more biomass when they've got more carbon dioxide to work with. As a general rule, it's going to vary from species to species, but that's one of the things that's going on right now. They're getting a boost that way. Poison sumac or poison ivy, on the other hand, don't put the carbon dioxide into more plant growth. They put it into more urushiol, and so they become more poisonous, more potent in fending off herbivores or just people who might touch them. Ragweed doesn't put it into plant defensive compounds, doesn't put it into biomass. It puts all of that extra carbon dioxide into creating a lot more pollen, and so it makes people's allergies worse. So each species is doing sort of its own thing, and we don't really know how that's going to affect how they compete with each other, and then ultimately which species are going to be dominant within a given ecosystem. And that's true not just of carbon dioxide, but of fire, of climate change, changes in mammal communities. These are all having effects on our systems. So one thing we can expect with changes in the drivers, these big drivers, at the scale that we're seeing them, we can expect that in some communities, the dominant species, say, beech and maple in a beech maple forest, are going to become rare, and that rare species in those systems, say ironwood, may become dominant. And it's going to look like invasion, even though it's really just a reshuffling of the species that are there. Dominant, common species become rare, rare species become common. There's no net change in species in that, but it looks like an invasion. It's going to be increasingly difficult to tell apart invasions because a species is coming from another continent, and invasions that are being driven by these other system drivers. And I guess one of the sort of take-home messages that I want to portray with this is that it's uncertain, deeply uncertain, how fast these systems will change. In the past, when we look at the pollen record, for example, temperature regime changes forests very, very slowly. It can take between centuries to thousands of years before a forest will change because the temperature has changed. That may be different now that we've got these other things going on, and we're managing forests more actively, disturbing them more. But in the past, that was a very, very slow change, whereas a change in a drought regime can have a very quick change in an ecosystem. Same thing with fire regime would probably be somewhere in the middle. But we don't know how fast, when we start mixing all of these together, we don't know how fast these systems are going to change, and how fast we're going to start seeing dominant species swapping out with rare species. So what do we do about that? It's kind of, overwhelming when you look at it. Nobody likes the message that things are uncertain and we have less control than we thought we did. But one thing we can do is get a little more control over the system if we think from a systems perspective and start looking at where there's greater leverage in a system. So this is a sort of systems thinking, which you can take entire classes or read books on. It's boiled down into one slide here. I thought this was a good summary slide. But it basically says that if you operate in the area of material, this is where you're dealing with symptoms, you're trying to affect the biomass of a certain species on the landscape. It's relatively easy to do, but it has a relatively small amount of leverage. A lot of times the changes that you make don't stick. Something happens once you remove that pressure, that change, once you're done treating, for example. If you can start to address the processes, though, that cause an invasion, say, trying to remove nutrient inputs that are causing, narrow-leaf cattail outbreaks in a wetland, that can have a bigger change. It's a little harder to move the lever in that spot, but it can have a longer-term change. Now, if you can get out to the level of the design of the system or the intent of the system, and this would be, say you're working with a golf course that has problems with narrow-leaf cattail in its wetlands. If the idea for the golf course is entirely golf and has nothing to do with ecological values, they're going to keep having this problem because they're going to keep putting nutrients in. Whereas if they change their goals to be, a sustainable golf course, if there is such a thing, I'm sure there is such a thing, at least in theory, they could change their nutrient inputs, change how they manage their whole system, which could then have changes in the processes like how they use their fertilizer, how they water their golf courses, which would then change material. So it has a larger leverage. So when we start talking in the area of goals, we can have a larger, more sustainable impact. And this is something that's used across systems design, not just in ecological systems, but also in social systems, economic systems, and so on. And this is sort of where this resist, accept, direct framework comes in, because it's operating at this level of intent, at the level of goals, and how we're looking at the system. And I think it works best if we think about having a portfolio of different lands that we're working on and trying to pick out where do we want to do different approaches, or do we want to do different approaches on different parts of a land portfolio. It's a fairly simple framework, which starts with just this question of, are you trying to shape the trajectory of change? Let's say it's a wilderness area where it's completely hands-off, so there's no shaping the trajectory of change. That would be just that you accept what's going to happen. This could also be an area that maybe has so many invasives that and so few other values that it becomes a low priority for doing work in that area, and so it becomes an accept area. But if you are managing an area for change, then the question becomes, are you managing it for historical conditions? Are you trying to restore it to a high quality ecosystem? If so, then you're in the resist category. If not, then you're in this direct category. Resist and accept are probably where we're usually binning the work that we do in invasive species. And the direct one is a little bit of a different way of looking at things, but it's going to have to become more common as systems change. So one example for this would be looking at a couple different scenarios. This one would be Hunter blue butterflies on a remnant oak savanna. Let's say you've got a large population of butterflies, lots of native ants, many native savanna plants. You've got an ecosystem that has lots of feedback, a lot of systems working closely together. But you've noticed that spotted knapweed has been invading over the past 5 years, and it's becoming more common. This would be a good candidate for resisting. Similarly, you might have carnival butterflies, but they're on a former ag field, or a former ag field that's now an old field, kind of barren. It's a smaller population, so it's less of a priority maybe for the managers. Has no native ants, and lupin is really the only native savanna plant, but it seems to be stable relative to spotted knapweed on the site. This could be an area where we would just accept what's going on, but because it's a savanna, it's got some management needs as far as setting back succession and keeping it open. So this would be a good candidate for direct transformation. You'd be managing the area intentionally to try to keep it from succeeding to forest, but you wouldn't necessarily be trying to get rid of the spotted knapweed because it's the only food source for those butterflies when they're in their adult stage. And it would take a lot of expensive work to get it to be a high quality savanna remnant. And then the other one would be just a regular old field with lots of autumn olive and other common species. No indicator species of quality communities. This would be a good candidate for just accept, especially if it's not causing harm in other ways. Some examples. I think for now, probably the places to focus resistance are where invasion is the cause of problems in the ecosystem and not just a symptom, and where system interactions still exist and are relatively intact. So where you expect that if we remove invasives, the system is going to be sustainable and a high quality. These are probably going to be relatively rare on the landscape, although they're probably where we do a lot of our work right now. Focus of acceptance is going to be where invasive species are not causing much harm right now, and where there's not a lot of benefit and not a lot of vectors for their spread into areas where they would cause harm. This is probably, unfortunately, fairly common. And then directed transformation is going to be where maybe an invasive, or maybe in this case would be a non-native species, appears to be causing a benefit locally, where there are a few vectors for it to get outside of the area and where monitoring is relatively easy. You can keep an eye on it. I think in the future, these are probably going to become more common. So this gets back to the punchlines for this resist, accept, direct framework as a way to sort of wrap our head around either climate change or these other system transformations. We want to pick winnable battles. These will be areas where we resist the effects of those drivers, but we also want to be explicit where invasion can't be stopped. We want to accept that that's happening, or at least signal to everyone else that we're choosing not to work here so we can work there, for example. And then pick places where transformation and novel communities are the goal. And this is where we direct transformation to something that hopefully is sustainable and more resilient, but might look a little bit different than what was there historically. So with that, not sure if I have too much time for questions, but I'm available if they're there.